And welcome to another episode of Coffee Shop Philosophy. As always, I'm your host, Killian, journalism director at think-liberty.com and part of the Think Liberty network of podcasts. As always, you can follow us on all forms of social media. You can check us out on YouTube for our videos and other material that ends up there. You can go to our shop, find out new merch that we always put out there. And you can hit the little subscribe bell on the website for daily updates for all the new and exciting articles that come out, exploring philosophy, economics, general opinion, and interesting pieces of news that come down the cycle. Now, for today's episode, I wanted to go into something that I'm sure many of us out there enjoy, but we very rarely make the link back to some of our own political stances. Or if we do, we see that a lot of the connections that are made are not quite made in our favor. So what I'm referring to is liberty in media. So there was a brilliant little podcast that was done, I think it was a few weeks back. I forget the exact episode number right now, of the Think Liberty podcast, where they discussed musicians primarily being to the left and things like that. But I wanted to dive a little bit more into both movie and literary. So I wanted to give a few examples of not just liberty, but of political ideologies being put to play inside of the media that we consume. So to start off, I'll start on the left and work our way over, so to speak, and go to the most cited version of a social system that we see, which is, of course, Star Trek. Now, for the maybe two of you that have never heard of Star Trek before or have never watched any of it, basically it's a sci-fi series that takes place about 400 years in the future, or 500 years in the future, depending on which version you're watching. And in the series, there's no real economy anymore in the truest sense. They have replicators for most of their basic needs. Most positions have been replaced by automation, save certain things like the military, which is a vast and expansive military in their world. And there's generally a sense where there's no profit-driven ideas. There's no every man for themselves ideas on Earth anymore. We've moved past that into more socialist terrain where everyone works together just for the betterment of society itself. That's the thinking. Now, I always find this a very interesting application of socialist ideas, because the people that usually use this as an example are the ones that preach more of a liberty-oriented socialism, if you will. It's usually left libertarians or people who consider government overreach or excessive corporate power or government power to be a bad thing. And yet they'll cite the show, which it always follows the military of the planet-covering and multi-planet covering Federation. So in the series, there's a human-centric military group that's effectively the leaders of this world, which is the Federation. Primarily, it's high-end military that's part of a cross-planetary government that oversees multiple sections of the galaxy. In the series, you usually follow a ship that is driven on the ideas of science and discovery and their exploration of different planets while they follow their own codes and their own rules, all to reach out and discover what's going on in the universe, and they get into their little hijinks as time goes on. Now, this gets cited quite often as a perfect example of post-capitalist socialism. What's wrong with that, though, is that it requires such a level of technology to be viable, and it assumes that all forms of human nature are going to be superseded as time progresses, and no person is going to have capitalistic ideologies. That's just two of the initial problems here. Another problem with this example, again, I've already listed it here, the excessive military aspect. The entire system primarily works under the control of the military, under the Federation. Sure, there's politicians and ambassadors and things like that get dealt with, but for the most part, all of the decision-making that you see as far as how the planet is driven, how the planets interact with each other, almost all comes from this Federation. this military organization that runs the entire planet. Now, the story of it is that everyone's okay with this because it protects the planet and they're free to do as they please on Earth. They're working to better each other. They're not working to, sustain themselves or make ends meet because they don't need to. And this is primarily due to the advanced technologies that exist. So, the number one being the replicators. It's an item that allows you to create pretty much everything that you would ever need, including food. So in this world, they've bypassed scarcity. So without any form of scarcity, of course, you're going to see a decline in capitalistic systems simply because there's not going to be a need for them if you can truly get rid of scarcity of commodities. That's just a standard. That's something to expect. But people will cite this show as an example of that and say that we could work towards that right now, despite the fact that even by the show's standards, we are several centuries away from that thinking. A lot of other series or a lot of other shows that go into this type of perfect socialist or perfect communistic utopia also tend to be from the science fiction genre. They tend to be set, hundreds, if not thousands of years into the future of humanity. And it works from this premise that we're going to bypass the limitations of our planet. We're going to bypass the social drives of humanity and instill in every single person a completely different worldview than they currently have. And it's going to be so effective that people aren't going to have those types of ideas anymore. It's not going to be something that crosses their mind that, no, this is mine, I own it, this is mine, it's all for me, which isn't the embodiment of capitalism. But even if you go to the far socialist view and say that that's the mentality of capitalism, it's still absurd to believe that we're going to reach a point where nobody thinks like that. It makes zero sense to use this as a perfect example of socialism, considering that for the way that it's portrayed in the show, so much of it banks on things that either don't exist, won't exist forever and a day, or are practically impossible without massive amounts of cross-planet indoctrination. That's one thing that I find that the left could really work on, because there's so many other examples of decent socialism in film and in literary works and in TV shows that they could draw from. But instead, they almost always hone in on this. They always hone in on Star Trek. Why Star Trek? I don't know. Because as I've said already, there are so many reasons why this is a terrible example of socialism in action and a terrible draw point if you're trying to create a vision of what socialism could be. Now, if we're looking at other ideologies, there's some good examples out there, but again, a lot of them suffer the same issue. A great example would be one of my personal favorite books, in the fiction category anyway, or at least in new fiction, because most of the books I like are a little bit more on the classic side. A great example of this is a book by Neil Stephenson called Snow Crash. Now, Neil Stephenson touches on quite a few different political ideologies, or at least blends a lot of different political ideologies into the background of some of his primary work. In this particular book, the baseline background to it, so not so much the storyline. I definitely recommend that you go pick up a copy of the book or find a copy online, whatever you need to do, go to your library and pick one up there. It's a great read. But the total background in this is that there has been such a degree of hyperinflation that $1 trillion is used as change and a quadrillion dollars is used as a small bill. The United States has experienced massive amounts of hyperinflation, and this has led to the creation of gated communities that are corporately owned. So one of the gated communities is owned by effectively the mafia, who also run businesses and everything else, but they own the entire community, and then people buy houses inside of the community following the community rules, and then going for an almost Hoppian gated community idea where each of these gated communities are their own corporations or are a subsect of a larger corporation that owns all of these different little groupings. In addition, they have their own currencies most of the time. There's advanced technologies involved there. There's also the concept of the metaverse, which is effectively a virtual reality internet. So you go online and you would actually put on a virtual reality headset and enter the internet that way. This book touches on the idea of anarcho-capitalism in that sense, because it creates this idea where the government's effectively been rendered useless. The majority of people make their transactions online, or they use the currencies created by these corporations, because these currencies can be used internally inside of the communities that make up the majority of the United States at this point. The concept of the President of the United States, while it's a position that still exists, is effectively just laughed at. It's not a position of any power. There's a little power that the equivalent of the FBI in the book still has, but again, it mostly just gets laughed at. A lot of people are left to their own devices in this world, so you have it where you don't have a lot of interference from actual, government-issued police. You don't have a lot of interference from, regulations or anything like that, because everything that you're doing, for the most part, is taking place inside of these closed-gated communities that have their own sets of rules. Now, this isn't strictly a anarcho-capitalist idea. This actually touches on a concept known as distributed republics. So the idea of a distributed republic is basically a fluid republic that scatters across the land. So by the land, I mean the whole world, not necessarily just inside of one geographic area. But this is a, loosely connected separation of corporate entities with large land masses, anarchist communities that are completely disconnected from the rest of the grid, effectively a form of, I guess you could say almost a form of panarchy at that point, where you have closed off different sections, people are owning and controlling their areas of land, but you're going to see a lot of changes in this situation than you would with traditional nation states. This is a pretty common theme in cyberpunk, which is what Snow Crash is considered a version of, but it also touches on two other political ideologies that go in there. That one's more towards the ownership side, because land ownership can transfer wildly, and because of how neutered the government is in this system, it means that every time that land ownership shifts, then the quote-unquote borders of these mini republics also shift with it. But another interesting aspect that this book touches on is the concept of techno-libertarianism as well as crypto-anarchism. So to separate the two, because they are different political philosophies, a techno-libertarianism goes into the idea that you should have a meritocracy. So people's positioning should be based on what they've actually accomplished rather than any other form of hierarchy that a system could have. Another good example with this idea of techno-libertarianism is the idea that there should still be a limitation on government regulation. It should be minimized, if not abolished. And anything that interferes with the internet or with people's freedom of expression when it comes to the internet needs to be opposed. People should be able to be completely free on the internet in their interactions with each other, and they shouldn't have to worry about censorship from the government, interference from the government, or regulations controlling the way that they interact with each other on the internet. They should be free citizens on the internet is the focus of techno-libertarianism. A great example of this would be Julian-Asange, the guy from WikiLeaks. He believes that people should be completely free and unrestricted and uncensored when it comes to their work on the internet or their interactions with each other on the internet. The other ideology I touched on was crypto-anarchism, which is a very similar concept. It's very much in the same line that people should have the same amounts of freedom. People should be able to work separately without having to worry about government interference, and they should have complete political, economic freedom and privacy. The difference, though, is that techno-libertarians will push from this from a policy perspective or as a general standpoint, whereas crypto-anarchism pushes for having cryptic software employed to completely mask their identity and leave themselves completely anonymous. Not to be confused with the 4chan anonymous, but just to be left anonymous. It's a relatively, not new, but new as far as most political stances are concerned. It actually came from a little booklet, the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto. Came out in 1988. I'm going to say 1988. I might be wrong. If I'm wrong, do let me know. But I believe it was 1988 by a Timothy May, who came up with the initial principles and different ways of ensuring your anonymity when you're online. Obviously, this has become a massive focal point for a lot of people, especially just in the libertarian movement in general, when certain things like Prism and the like came up. So the fact that this came out with this idea was pushed on in a book from 1992 really speaks volumes to how ahead of the time he was on his thought process with this. That said, he wasn't the only person to be ahead of his time when it comes to thinking about the effects of technology or of liberty in their own works. For example, I'll use well-known writer H.G. Wells. One of the most, I guess you could say, libertarian books that H.G. Wells ever put out, and he put out quite a few books that touched on the idea of a libertarian utopia, but his book from 1924, Men Like Gods, was probably the best example of this. Now, again, keep in mind, this is 1924 that this book came out. This is coming up on a century old that he came out with this book. Now, in this particular book, he goes into the idea of a parallel universe where Earth is thousands of years more advanced than ours. So this is, eons and eons into the future of this parallel alternate Earth. A key point in this Earth is that there is no government, there is no over control or social institutions. None of those things particularly exist because A, this one solitary point that is indoctrinated into children from the very beginning is that you respect the autonomy of others. It is the singular guiding principle that is driven into every single person born on this imagined Earth. Secondly, they are genetically engineered to be effectively the best, to reach a form of perfection. That way, all they have to worry about is enjoying life, enjoying themselves. They take care of the work they need to take care of, and they don't have to have any form of overseer making things happen. They don't need a form of governance in order to have this kind of utopic world that they have. Now, again, and I mentioned this earlier in the episode, this kind of doesn't work. Again, it's a great example of what a utopia could look like, but it suffers the same issues that Star Trek suffers, which is that it's a utopia. And I mean, I understand that it's fiction. So in the world of fiction, you're going to explore ideas or take things to zeniths that you know are not possible in the real world. Because you're working in fiction, you are trying to create a story, you're trying to craft a narrative, and you're trying to take things to places that we know we're not going to see here. We know that are next to impossible to see on the planet that we have. But we still want to explore these ideas, these concepts, and these worlds. If we're trying to use things like this as an example, though, it again suffers the weakness of being a utopia. It suffers the idea of genetically modified perfect humans and total global indoctrination of all youth into a singular idea. As great as it would be, and I think that a lot of parents should push the idea that you respect the autonomy of others and make that a central point in their education and upbringing, the idea that that's going to be perfect across the board and it's going to be indoctrinated to such a point that no one along the line questions it, that part is what makes it practically impossible. Still an excellent read. I definitely suggest reading just about anything by H.G. Wells. He does some of the most amazing science fiction or early science fiction work that you're ever going to come across from anyone in that era of late 1800s to early 1900s. He's definitely a pioneer and a forefather in the genre of literature. But another example I'll use here, it's still a science fiction example here, but I'll use a little book. It's not the smallest book, but a little book called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. Now, this book was written by Robert A. Heinlein. Now, you may not recognize the name immediately, but for those of you that do, he's best known for taking his pop shots at the complicated militarism in his book Starship Troopers. He's also known for writing on things such as sexual revolution in Stranger in a Strange Land. But I want to focus on The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. This book is one of the most successful attempts that I've ever come across in taking a political belief, especially a libertarian political belief, and weaving it into the narrative of a story without the story becoming just that political narrative. So I mean, Ayn Rand is guilty of that one, where all of the long-winded speeches in her books, such as Atlas Shrugged, that just go on and become less a story or less a novel and more just her philosophy coming out of the mouthpiece of a character that she created just to deliver this portion of her philosophy. And I get it. I understand the thinking behind that type of writing, and it does deliver, even though there's things that I agree with, things I disagree with, it does deliver a compelling argument. But as far as what it does for the narrative, from the actual storytelling perspective, that's where her works suffer, at least in my opinion. This book, however, is a great read. It's tons of fun to go through. One that's great as well is that you'll have a character, Professor, excuse me if I'm forgetting the name here, just for a random side note, but for those of you that do listen, I know a lot of podcasts, what they'll do is they'll have partial scripts, or they'll have a whole bunch of information sitting in front of them, and they'll go through all of their notes on particular things. I generally don't take that approach with these podcasts. I go through something that I know is not so much near and dear to me, but something that I'm at least immersed in, or something that I'm knowledgeable on, and I try to bring that information out to you guys. So if I forget the name of a certain author, or forget the date of a certain thing that took place, or the title of a book or something like that, then that's just generic human error on my part. It's not like a planned miss or anything like that. If I'm recalling it correctly, the character's name, getting back on topic, was Bernardo de la Paz, I want to say. Bernardo de la Paz. He called himself a rational anarchist. So how many books do you read that someone actually refers to themselves as a rational anarchist? In this book, he, similar to the Ayn Rand novels, he goes on a speech talking about the ills of government. How even if it's a democratically elected government, it is still a group of people that are assuming power over the general public. So no matter how democratic the system is, it still runs the risk of being a threat to the freedom and well-being of the populace. Now, again, unlike Ayn Rand, the book actually just reads well on its own. Even if you're not into the particular political philosophy, just as a book, it is a excellent read. I, again, highly recommend that book and pretty much anything else the author has come out with. So just to save you from rewinding, the author's name is Robert Heinlein. That's Heinlein, I believe. Yeah, Heinlein. Yes. So that's another example of someone taking their political ideology and putting it into a work of fiction, putting it into media, and being able to bring it forward. And again, we usually see this from more of the left, or at least from that vision of it. Otherwise, we usually see dystopias. We see worlds where the government has gone into overdrive and there's almost a neo form of fascism that has completely swept the entire world, and we're following the, plucky rebel that's going to bring the system down and bring back freedom and peace to everybody. Or we see a form of corporate takeover where the entire world is being controlled by the evil, greedy capitalists, and people just want to live and be separate from all of that, and they're not allowed to because it's a dystopia, so of course things have gotten terrible. Great examples of this are one of the older ones, Soylent Green. Now, I don't care if I spoil Soylent Green. The movie is decades old. If you haven't seen it by now, that's on you. I'm just going to say that now. I'm not worried about spoiling the big twist. In the movie, they're in a dystopia where they need to pedal a bike in order to keep electricity going. There's massive food shortages that are solved with Soylent Green, which is an all-nutrient meat patty, it's kind of like a tofu, but it's made from meat and meat byproduct. And Soylent Orange, which is the same thing but made of vegetable matter. And you go through the story seeing how terrible this world is, to the point where they have centers for people to commit suicide effectively. It's an assisted suicide facility to let people go peacefully. In this world, though, at the end of it, they discover that Soylent Green, which is what's allowing people to continue to eat and exist, Soylent Green is only possible because it's made out of people. So all the people that decide to go to these care centers to end their lives and pass away peacefully rather than just dying randomly at home or in the streets, all the people that go to these facilities are being turned into food. And in this story, the idea is that the world economy and everything else has gotten so terrible that that's what we've been reduced to. That's what we've had to resort to. Another more recent or more popular example would be the Hunger Games series. In the Hunger Games series, which is based in Canada, of all things, it's nice to see a series blow up that's based in Canada, despite the type of world setting that it's based on. But in the series, both the books and the film, the idea is that the government power has centralized in one particular area that completely controls every aspect of every other province, which in this case is every other district's lives. All of them are centrally planned where each district is devoted to one particular type of manufacturing or mining or harvesting or one aspect of the economy, and most of the wealth is hoarded into a central, highly urbanized space. So you'll have areas that are more plains-like, where it's mainly hunting and farming, and all of the resources are pulled out by this central government and primarily gathered for the use of the central government and the surrounding area. So it becomes very region-specific as to who gets the majority of the wealth from the entire country. Now, obviously, the way the story goes is that Everdeen Katniss, she takes part in the Hunger Games, which the series is named after. It's basically a tournament fight to the death with different pairs of kids from each one of the districts, and results in her winning. Then she gets a little bit more involved in the higher end of what's going on, gets pulled into the rebellion, and the whole thing evolves from there. So it's your standard, plucky hero rebels against the evil, over-controlling government. Which really brings me to another point that I always find very interesting. Most of our heroes, when it comes to film or to books or anything like that, most of our heroes are rebels. Now, I wrote a piece about this. It was one of my earlier pieces, actually, when I first started to join in with Think Liberty here. One of the earlier pieces I wrote was about our heroes being rebels. So when we're seeing political action in novels, or at least in media in general, most of the time we see this interaction, we know who we're rooting for, but we don't actually take any of that away. So if you watched Star Wars, let's say, you'll see the idea of a cross-galactic government, very similar to the Federation concept from Star Trek, but definitely less benevolent. So in this case, it's a dictatorship under Palpatine. He runs basically the entire galaxy. The Jedi, which were originally the good guys on the council, they're completely wiped out and obliterated once you get to the first movie, which is actually the fourth movie. I always thought that was weird, but that's beside the point. So you'll go through this world and you'll follow Luke Skywalker as he pushes and fights back against the Republic and eventually faces off against Palpatine and Darth Vader, and he ends up killing them. And, well, he doesn't end up killing them, but I'll leave that to the few of you that might not have actually watched it. So he goes through as this nobody on this barren planet and ends up being the hero that saves the day by taking on this massively oppressive government as part of the rebellion. Now, you take a look at real world politics, and if a person said that the government is oppressive and they want to fight back against it and they're actually going to be a part of a rebellion like that, then they would be labeled as terrorists. You wouldn't look at them as the plucky hero fighting against oppression. You wouldn't see them as the rebels from Star Wars, or you wouldn't see one of the figureheads as a Luke Skywalker. You would look at them and you would think it's the IRA, because they're fighting back against what they believe is an oppressive government, even though other people are looking at it and going, well, my life's good enough as it is. So I think even if your politics come from either the, left media, or they come from more libertarian media or even right media, then I always have to ask why we know who we're cheering for or what we're looking for in these forms of media, but we don't allow any of these concepts to translate back over to us in real life. I'll use one last example here. Comic books. Comic books are a great example. The majority of comic books that are out there, save, maybe the Archie novels that you pick up on your way out of the grocery store, the majority of the comic books and graphic novels that we read involve some form of hero or superhero going out and fighting for justice and making sure that, they deal with the bad guy and lock him away and they save the world, or sometimes there's more in-depth political intrigue between the characters, or we're seeing heroes that are working outside of the system to make sure that justice is served and to make sure that the people are protected and to make sure that they save lives and that they help people. And in the same sense, when we're watching these heroes go and be heroes, we can't spare $2 to drop in a little bin once the Santas come out in December ringing for the Salvation Army asking for a little bit of change to help out. We can't be bothered with that, but our heroes are literally heroes. So I find that it's always interesting that regardless of the amount of politics there, the amount of ideas or philosophies that are put into our media, the amount that we take away from it and actually put into practice in real life is very minimalistic. Now, on the one hand, I agree with keeping it minimalistic simply because we shouldn't be basing our worldview strictly on works of fiction. But in the same sense, if there's something that we can see in an action, even if it's a fictionized action, if it's something we can see in action and it's something we identify with and we want to cheer on and we want to believe in and get behind, then why not take some of these ideas with us if it's something we know we agree with? Maybe even just to read up more on the ideas that are in play and then seeing what steps fit our lives to put these philosophies into action. I'm going to wrap everything up here. Hopefully you enjoyed the episode. As always, like I mentioned before, I know I said on the last episode I wasn't going to do the plugs all the time, but I find it's just an easy way to wrap everything up, and it's become just a bad habit at this point. Follow us on everything. Listen to us on everything. Check out our website. Again, some of the best content we've got, at least in my opinion. I know some of the other podcast guys will fight me on this, but some of the best content that we have ends up right there on our website for anyone to come and read. If you have any suggestions for future episodes of the show or any feedback or comments on any of the other episodes that I've done, by all means, drop us a line on pretty much any of our social medias. And if you've enjoyed what you've heard, I'll see you again next week.